Chapter 12. Dani yawned and stretched as the ending credits rolled up the screen. It wasn't that she was tired, more that she had been sitting still for too long. She looked over to find Mark curled up on the floor, sound asleep. It appeared the cute-looking creature who turned evil when wet didn't scare him. Somehow she wasn't surprised. She stretched her bare foot across the empty space on the sofa that separated them, and nudged Zach to point out their son. "Does he do that often?" Zach's voice was barely more than a whisper. Dani nodded. "I have to carry him to bed, as often as not." She started to stand. "No, let me." Zach stood and went to where Mark lay curled in his favorite blanket. He knelt and scooped the boy up with an ease that Dani hadn't been able to manage in a couple years. "Where?" Zach looked at her. Dani stood and led him into Mark's room. She turned on the light. "Just lay him on the bed," she said. "He sleeps like a rock." Zach set the sleeping boy gently onto the bed and stepped back. Dani moved in and pulled the blanket up to his chin, then kissed the child's forehead. "Come on, let's let him sleep." She waved Zach out of the room, turned out the light, and pulled the door closed. "Will he be all right after watching that?" Zach really didn't know what time he spent with kids was at school, not dealing with the dreams from watching scary movies. Not that Gremlins was all that terrifying, but he wasn't 9 anymore either. "He'll be fine." She moved away from the door and back toward the living room. "He sleeps like a rock and nearly nothing phases him. He loves these movies. The scarier, the better." She sat back down and hoped he would too. She'd enjoyed just having him near again, even if she hadn't even touched him. Not because she didn't want to. Her hands ached to bury themselves in what used to be some of the softest hair she'd ever felt. Well, before Mark. His was actually baby fine and baby soft. "They don't keep him from sleeping?" Zach sat back where he had been on the far end of the sofa. This time he turned to face her. "I thought they might too, but they never have." It was something that still surprised her. "Still, I'm careful about what I let him see." She wiggled to get a little more comfortable, and picked her feet up onto the couch between her and Zach. "He's something else." Zach shook his head as if he didn't quite know what to say. "You've done an amazing job. I'm just sorry I wasn't there." "I'm sorry too." She looked down at her hands. She felt guilty her father had lied to him, but at the same time, she was angry. Not at Zach, at her dad. His lies had stolen a lot of possibilities. From all of them. Stolen the chance for Mark to have known his father all his life. That alone pissed her off, but what good was it to be mad at a dead man? None. It only made her life harder. She was still staring at her hands, trying to move past the anger that sat in her throat, when someone, it had to be Zach, picked up one of her bare feet and started kneading the stiff, sore muscles with his thumbs. She looked up to find him watching her, an intense look she wasn't sure how to read on his face. Her question must have been written on her face, because he answered before she could ask. "You look tense. You've been working all day, and I know after a long day my feet hurt. I thought you might enjoy it." His hands never stopped working their magic on her feet, and she bit back a groan she knew would sound way too sexual. "I'll give you a week to stop." She closed her eyes and let her head fall back against the back of the couch. "No, a month." He hit a tense spot and gave it more attention, making her wince until the knot eased, but she wouldn't ask him to stop for anything. She'd sworn for years she didn't need anyone else. And she didn't, but man, this alone made it almost worth putting up with another person. Almost. She was afraid she'd gotten stuck in her ways, and she didn't want to change them. She liked not being challenged over every decision she made about Mark, or anything else. There were days she was convinced that when Mark grew up and moved out, she'd become one of those old women who lived alone for the rest of her life. Maybe with a billion cats, but she wasn't sure about that part. She didn't care much for cats. Zach set the first foot down and picked up the other, giving it the same treatment. This time she couldn't hold back the moan. I used to have to do a lot more to get a sound like that out of you. She opened her eyes and found not the smirk she'd expected but a fond half-smile. She shook her head. That's probably the only one you'll get. I've not had the other kind in so long, I'm not sure I'm capable anymore. As much as I'd like to take that as a challenge, I don't think it's the right time. He sent a pointed look toward the door between them and their son. Heat pooled low in her belly, as she remembered the intense sensations and emotions he was once capable of sending through her body. Something told her if she let him, he'd be just as deeply embedded in her heart as he'd once been. But could she handle that again? Could she risk her heart and her son's on him again? She knew in her head that her heartbreak hadn't been him, but her heart wasn't yet convinced. That would only come with time and patience, if he was interested in more than knowing his son. Probably not. Dani pulled her foot from his grasp and swung her feet off the edge of the sofa as she sat up. I should be going, Zach said. You probably have to get up early, and I'm keeping you up. Let me get your pan. Keep it. You two eat the leftovers. That way you won't have to cook for a couple days. That's sweet. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me tonight. Zach stood. I enjoyed it. It was fun. She stood to walk him to the door and to lock it behind him. We'll have to do it again. Zach stopped at the door and turned. When's your next day off? Thursday. Why? I thought, if it's okay with you, maybe I could take you and Mark out fishing. I can borrow my folks' boat, it's big enough for all of us. He looked uncertain. Do you think that's something he'll like? It sounds great. And he'll love it. Especially if you'll teach him how to clean the catch when we're done. In case you haven't noticed, the messier and grosser something is, the more he loves it. Then can I start making plans? He looked hopeful. She thought for a minute, trying to remember if she had anything scheduled, and couldn't remember anything. Why not? Go ahead and make plans. I'm sure I'll be in touch between now and then. Either way, you know how to get a hold of me. Sounds great. He stared down at her for a few moments, then let out a sigh. I'm having a hard time resisting the urge to kiss you. Her heart skipped a beat and her chest ached. Maybe Zach was interested in more than just his son. Why bother? She gazed up at him, wondering what a kiss would feel like after so long without. She didn't have long to wait. Oh hell. Like I could resist now. Zach's mouth lowered to hers. The touch of his lips was feather soft at first, then he grew bolder. Heat pooled low in Dani's belly. She had kissed a few men since the last time she'd kissed Zach, but no other man had managed to make her body cry out and beg for more with just a gentle touch of his lips like he did. Without planning to, her hand came up to cup his cheek as her mouth opened beneath his, and she tasted him for the first time in more than 10 years. It was like a homecoming. Something she'd missed for way too long. But also not the same. She didn't have what it took to analyze it at the moment, so she just enjoyed. After a moment or two, Zach pulled away. I should go. He opened the door and was gone before she could protest. She knew it was for the best. But damn. For a moment, she wished she'd stopped him. Dani watched his taillights disappear down the drive, then closed the door and locked it. He had been right. She did have an early morning tomorrow. Dani lay in bed a while later, reliving that brief kiss, over and over. She hadn't been a nun since Mark had been born. She'd dated some, though she could admit to herself it hadn't been a priority. She'd had Mark to take care of, and that had been more important. Still, she thought Zach's kiss shouldn't affect her so much. Was it lingering feelings for him? Was it that she was so hungry for the touch of a man? She sighed, rolled over and punched her pillow. Dani wasn't sure what she needed, but lying here unable to sleep, thinking of him, wasn't it. She pushed all thoughts of Zach out of her mind, then concentrated on counting backwards from 100. She hadn't made it to 80 when there he was, back on her mind again. She knew she needed to get some sleep, but as long as he was on her mind, that wouldn't be happening. She pushed him out again, clearing her mind like a table and putting each thought away on a shelf before wiping the surface clean. With a clean surface to work from, she imagined her body lying on the table, not unlike a patient on a gurney in her ambulance. She started at the top of her head and imagined a line moving down her body, pushing all the stress and tension down. Bit by bit, inch by inch, she imagined it being shoved down until it leaked out the tips of her toes. As the imaginary bar that pressed all the tension out of her body moved lower and lower, it left any part of her body that it had passed through completely relaxed. She'd not yet reached her waist when she drifted off to sleep. Dani woke slowly. Her alarm screamed. She rolled out of bed and staggered across the room to silence the alarm. Blinking several times, she slapped at the clock that sat on the dresser on the far side of the room from her bed. She'd learned long ago she needed to keep it out of her reach or she'd turn it off in her sleep, long before it had a chance to go off. Once the electronic screaming stopped, she stood blinking for a couple moments, then went to start coffee and wake Mark. She put on her uniform and pulled her hair up out of the way while the coffee brewed, and Mark got dressed. "Cheerios or Wheaties?" she asked as she headed back to the kitchen. "Cheerios," Mark called back. Dani poured his cereal but left it dry in the bowl, as she moved on to pour a travel mug full of coffee, adding a liberal amount of sugar. Mark came in, shoes in hand. "Milk this morning?" "Not today." He wrinkled his nose as he plopped onto a kitchen chair and put on his shoes. He took bites of his cereal in between. Dani started to tell him he should finish with his shoes, then wash his hands before eating, but stopped herself. A few germs were good for him. They built up his immune system. By the time Mark finished his cereal, Dani had finished her first cup of coffee and poured a second, this one without the sugar. That was all she allowed herself. 1 cup with sugar. If she needed a second or gasp a third, then she had to drink them black. She hurried him along, getting him packed and out into the car just in time to keep from being late. She was glad Sarah had agreed to keep him, and she didn't have to get out every morning and check him into his before-school care. Not that it was the time of year for school, but the concept was the same. Sarah knew he was coming and he could go inside on his own, and once he was safe inside, she could go on ahead to work. It was one less thing to worry about when she wasn't fully awake. It was time for work. 12 hours in an ambulance with Greg. Not that it was a hardship. Dani loved this job and so far she liked her partner. She was still getting to know him, but he seemed like a good guy. Dani sighed and rolled her head around, letting it hang for a moment then dropping it back as she tried to stretch the stiff and sore muscles. "Long night?" Greg asked from the driver's seat. "Yeah." Dani sighed again. "I didn't sleep well." "How come?" "You want the easy answer, or some emotional vomit?" Greg took a deep breath and held it for a second. "Give me the emotional vomit. If nothing else, it might help to talk it out." Dani wasn't sure about Greg's reasoning, but what could it hurt? "I told you I have a son, right?" "You mentioned it." "I don't think I told you I lived in this area when I was in school." "Yeah, you said something about it. You said you dated the Roberts' son. The ones who run the bait shop on the far side of the lake." "That's right." "I did." She nodded, remembering the conversation. Remembering that, it will be less of a surprise when I admit that my son's father is Zach Roberts. No shit. No shit. She looked out the window on her side of the bus for a second. It's a long story as to why, but until a few days ago, I thought he knew and abandoned us. At the same time, he had no clue about Mark. He thought I'd left the area and him years ago and never looked back. Let me make sure I have this straight. You thought he abandoned you while pregnant, and he thought you had broken up with him? Yes. How does something like that happen? Not by accident. Greg frowned and glanced at her several times as he drove, waiting for her to elaborate. My dad did it. Who knows what he was thinking? Even Mom didn't know until he was in the hospital last year. And it's not like we can ask now. I take it your mom told you when you were just down there? Yeah. Dude, Greg said. Something about his tone made her turn to look at him. That was a serious dick move. He shook his head. I mean seriously. Dani couldn't help but chuckle. Not at his sentiment. She agreed with that. But the way he'd said it. You know your age is showing, right? What do you mean? Greg frowned. Dude? No one uses that anymore, at least not like you do. Greg lifted one shoulder. It's my thing. Everyone used to do it. Dude is a generic filler that had a lot of different meanings. I know. It just struck me as funny. Sometimes we have to laugh or we'll end up crying instead. She sighed. You don't want to see that. I'm not a pretty crier. Pretty crier or not, sometimes it helps to let it out. He glanced at her again. I know we don't know each other well yet, but give it time. After a while, we'll know each other's deepest, darkest secrets. Dani looked at Greg, confused. It can get pretty boring on duty, especially in the winter. We'll talk, share pretty much everything. Trust me. I've been doing this for almost 20 years. I don't doubt you. I just think it's weird. Weird it may be, but it's a fact. He drove a while longer in silence. She wasn't sure, but she thought he was letting her get used to the idea that he would know all her secrets, and she would know his. I'm hungry, wanna stop by the bait shop? Greg asked after a while. Dani glanced around. She'd been so lost in her own thoughts, she'd not realized they were on that side of the lake. Sure, why not? There was no point in putting off seeing his parents now. She had no doubt Zach had already told them about Mark. She could only hope they wouldn't be angry with her about it, as Greg pulled the bus in and parked in the almost empty lot. At least there wasn't anyone around to witness it, if they decided to take it out on her. They went inside, and Greg headed for the cooler in the back. Dani spotted Mrs. Roberts at the register. She had aged some but still looked much like Dani remembered. She looked up and Dani saw the instant Zach's mom realized who she was. Her face lit and she looked so happy. Relief washed through Dani as the other woman moved around the register and closed the distance between them. Dani, she asked as she came closer. It's me. She'd barely gotten the words out when the older woman reached her, wrapped both arms around her, and hugged her tight. I'm sorry to hear about your father's death, Mrs. Roberts said as she released Dani, but she didn't entirely let her go. She stepped back but kept her hands on Dani's upper arms. Though, if he was still around, I'd probably smack the crap out of him. I understand trying to do what he thought was best. But I don't understand keeping our grandson from us. She shook her head. Either way. What's done is done and we can't change it. How are you doing? Do you need anything? It took Dani a second to process it all and register the change of subject. We're doing fine. My partner and I just stopped for a bite to eat. She looked toward the back of the store where Greg still was. Oh, we see Greg all the time, he'll be along in a second. Where's Mark? That is what you call him, right? Yes, he's Mark and he's with Sarah Keene. I don't know if you'll remember her, she went to school with Zach and I. Zach's mother frowned. He's not with Zach? He doesn't know who Zach is yet. I wanted the two of them to get to know each other a little before I told him. I understand not wanting to overwhelm him. Her face fell. But you are going to tell him, right? We'll get a chance to know him? You'll get a chance to know him, Mrs. Roberts. It's just that he's had a lot of changes recently. I want to give him time to adjust before I push more on him. PFFT. She made the noise when Dani called her Mrs. Roberts. You're not a kid anymore. Call me Kara. Come on over here. Kara took Dani's arm and pulled her closer to the register. Do you have any pictures? Dani smiled and pulled out her phone. I do. Do you want to see? She pulled up the photo album and handed her phone to Kara, letting the older woman flip through some of the pictures. He really does look just like Zach. She held the phone close as if she wanted to hug it. And Zach was right, he has your eyes. Would you like me to send you some? Would you please? Kara handed Dani her phone back. Sure. Just give me your phone number. Dani punched in the number as Kara recited it for her, and quickly texted her several pictures of Mark. A few seconds later, a phone chirped under the counter. Oh, the older woman let out as she reached under the counter and pulled out her phone. I can't believe it, I have a grandson. She looked up at Dani, a grin spread across her face. You don't mind if I show these to my Mark, do you? Not at all. Dani couldn't help but smile at the adoration Kara was showing for a child she'd not even met yet. I'm so excited. I can't wait to meet him. She looked back down at the phone and the pictures on it. What's he like? A lot like his dad, really. He loves scary movies. I've not yet gotten him into reading, but I'm still looking for the right thing that will hook him. We still have some of the old movies Zach used to watch, but they're all on tape. You probably don't have a VCR, do you? No. That's okay. I'll just keep them for when he comes to visit. She looked up. You will let him visit, right? After he knows, once I know he's adjusted, of course I will. I suspect he will be thrilled to find out about more grandparents. I'm afraid my mom spoils him. Speaking of, how is Maggie doing? She's all right. She moved to Prescott a few months ago to be closer to her sister. She loves it there. I'm glad she's doing all right. Will you tell her I said hello? I will, the next time I talk to her. Greg appeared, a steaming burrito that had started out frozen in one hand, a bag of chips and bottle of soda in the other. You get your food yet? I'm okay. She eyed his double handful of junk and wondered how long until it would be him they were transporting to the small hospital in Brighton. So far, pre-packaged meals and processed stuff was all she'd seen him eat. Kara rang up his purchase and they headed for the door. Come by when you're not on duty. I want to talk more, Kara called after Dani. You have my number now, feel free to text or call when you have time. Dani smiled at the older woman. She'd always liked Zach's mom, and today had only increased her affection for her. That didn't seem to be so bad, Greg said once they were back in the ambulance. He sat in the driver's seat and ate his burrito. Unless there was a call out, there was nowhere they needed to be, so why not? She seemed to know about your boy already. She did. I told Zach he could tell them a few days ago. Looks like he did, and like they don't hold the secrecy against you. Dani nodded but didn't reply. She was thinking about how her Mark would handle meeting the man he'd been named after. She had no idea. Guessed she'd have to wait and see.